She pours the tea herself. That is where every version of this story begins, with her hands, with a cup, with a smile she is said to have offered to the man sitting across from her in the parlor of the 6-mile Wayfarer house, 6 miles north of Charleston, South Carolina, on a road that smelled of pine resin and horse dung and the particular dampness of low-country air in January. The fire is going. The light is warm. She is, by every account that has ever been written about her, extraordinarily beautiful, and the tea, they say, is laced with oleander, a plant whose leaves can stop a human heart in quantities as small as a single gram. And she watches him drink it, and she smiles, and she asks him questions to keep him awake long enough for the poison to take hold. And when at last he sways, when his eyes lose their focus, and his body begins to betray him, there is a trap door. There is always a trap door. He falls, and below the trap door, in the dark, what waits for him is the same thing that waited for every other traveler who made the mistake of stopping at the 6-mile Wayfarer house, who accepted the hospitality of Lavinia Fisher and her husband John, which is to say, nothing good and no way back. This is the legend of America's first female serial killer. None of it is true. What is documented is considerably stranger in the way that real things, lived by real people, inside real circumstances, are always stranger than the stories we build to replace them. The trapdoor has never been found. The oleander has never been substantiated in any court record or coroner's report from 1819 or 1820. The bodies, the dozens of travelers said to have vanished into the sandy soil of that Carolina road, exist nowhere in the contemporary record. What the Charleston court did record, what the newspapers of the period did print, and what the testimony of witnesses does confirm, is something more modest and considerably more human. Lavinia Fisher was convicted of highway robbery. She was hanged for it on February 18th, 1820. She was 26 years old, and the story that has consumed her, the poison, the trapdoor, the murders she may have committed in the 10s or 20s or hundreds, depending on which ghost tour you book in modern Charleston, that story was built after her death by people who had never met her, from imagination rather than evidence, and it has been growing ever since. The question is not whether Lavinia Fisher was innocent. She was not. The question is something harder than innocence. It is what happens to a person when the story the world tells about them becomes so much larger than the person ever was. When a real woman who committed real crimes, who stood on a real scaffold in a real dress and said what she said, or did not say it, when that real woman gets hollowed out and filled with something else entirely, the question is what we needed her to be, and why. To understand what actually happened at the 6-mile Wayfarer house, you have to understand what Charleston's outlying roads were in early 1819. The city itself was one of the wealthiest in the young republic, a port city built on rice and cotton and the labor of enslaved people, with grand townhouses on Meeting Street and churches whose spires you could see from the harbor. But 6 miles north, the roads narrowed, the tree cover thickened, the Wayfarer houses, the inns and taverns that served travelers on the road between Charleston and Columbia, were rough places. Some were legitimate, others were not. The distinction was not always clear until it was too late to matter. The 6-mile house was one of several establishments in that stretch of road that the city's Committee of Vigilance had identified as a problem. Not because of murders, because of robberies, because travelers were reporting that they had stopped at inns along that corridor and arrived at their destinations missing money, missing goods, sometimes missing their horses. The pattern was consistent enough that by early 1819 the committee had dispatched men to deal with it. What they found at the 6-mile house was a community, or something like one, a loose collection of men and women who appear in records as squatters, as persons of uncertain occupation, as associates of the Fishers. John Fisher appears to have been a kind of informal leader of this group. Lavinia, his wife, appears to have been present, conspicuous, and not afraid to make herself known. The committee's first visit, in February of 1819, went badly. What is recorded is that the vigilance men arrived and found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The group at the 6 Mile House did not submit. A man named David Ross, whose account is the closest thing we have to a contemporary first-person record of what occurred there, described being detained, held against his will, or something approaching it. He had been traveling alone on the Charleston Road and had made the decision to stop at the 6 Mile House, a decision that would cost him several hours and, depending on which version of his account you read, varying degrees of physical threat. Ross's testimony is where the legend begins, faintly, to take its first shape, and it is worth reading carefully, because what he describes and what later writers made of what he describes are not the same thing. What Ross described was this. He stopped at the inn. He was offered hospitality. He was at some point given reason to be afraid, whether through explicit threat or through the atmosphere of the place and its inhabitants is not entirely clear from surviving accounts. He spent time there under circumstances he found alarming. He eventually got out. He said nothing about poison. He said nothing about a trap door. He said he was robbed. The Vigilance Committee returned in force. What followed was less a law enforcement action than a confrontation, a physical clearing of the 6 Mile House and the surrounding area, with the committee's men ousting the residents by whatever means were available to them in 1819 South Carolina, which did not always mean means that would be recognized as lawful by later standards. Smell of kicked-up road dust, the creak of wagon wheels, the sound of a structure being emptied, shouting, the thud of a door thrown open against a wall, the particular silence that follows when a group of people realize they have lost. Some of the group's members dispersed. John and Lavinia Fisher did not. They were arrested. What followed was a period of legal proceeding that extended through 1819 and into 1820, with charges that reflected what the evidence actually supported: highway robbery, with a specific complaint arising from the David Ross incident and potentially others. Highway robbery in South Carolina in 1819 was a capital offense. This is the first thing to understand about the severity of what happened next. The Fishers were not facing a fine or a term of imprisonment from which they might eventually emerge. They were facing the gallows from the moment the charges were formalized. The law was unambiguous, and the court, when it considered the evidence before it, found that evidence sufficient. Lavinia Fisher stood trial for highway robbery. She was convicted. John Fisher was convicted alongside her. There was, in the trial record, no allegation of murder, no allegation of poison, no allegation of a trapdoor mechanism, a pit, a drop, or any form of concealed disposal of human remains. If such evidence had existed, it would have been introduced. The prosecutors had every incentive to introduce it. Capital cases were not gentle proceedings. The court was not inclined toward restraint when restraint was unnecessary. What is recorded is what was charged. What was charged is what was proven. What was proven is robbery, and they were sentenced to die for it. The interval between sentencing and execution was months. The Fishers appealed. The record shows attempts, legal, procedural, to avoid the scaffold, and those attempts failed. There is a report that Lavinia, at some point during this period, managed to exchange her dress for the clothing of a male visitor, or attempted to. The details are inconsistent across contemporary accounts in an effort to delay or circumvent execution on the grounds that a woman wearing men's clothes could not be hanged. Whether this was genuine legal strategy or desperate improvisation cannot now be determined. The prison records are incomplete. The story, as told later, became increasingly theatrical. What is not in question is that February 18th, 1820 arrived, that the scaffold was prepared, that a crowd assembled, as crowds did for public executions in that era, with a mixture of motives that the record does not detail and that we should not pretend were simple. Public execution in 1820 Charleston was both spectacle and civic ritual. It was meant to be witnessed. The presence of a crowd was not incidental. It was the point. The condemned were expected to perform their deaths correctly, to confess, to express remorse, to address the crowd in a manner that confirmed the legitimacy of the sentence. This is what the church expected. This is what the state expected. This is, most of the time, what happened. Lavinia Fisher, by the accounts that survive, did not cooperate with this expectation. She addressed the crowd. What she is reported to have said varies depending on the source and the date of that source. The version that has achieved the most circulation, that has appeared on merchandise, on ghost tour brochures, on websites dedicated to her legend, is the following. If any of you have a message for the devil, give it to me. I'll carry it. It is a perfect line. It has rhythm, defiance, and wit. It suggests a woman who walked to her death unbroken, who refused the performance of repentance that the occasion demanded, who claimed the scaffold as her stage rather than her end. It is exactly the line you would write if you were writing a character, which may in fact be what happened. The earliest sources that include this quote cannot now be traced to a contemporary newspaper account from 1820. The Charleston papers of the period reported the execution. They did so in the terse, formal language of the era's death notices, which described the event, its conclusion, and the manner in which the condemned met their end, without extensive quotation. A defiant final speech of the quality attributed to Lavinia Fisher would have been remarkable. It would have been notable. It would have been the kind of thing that newspapers, even restrained ones, would have included. Whether any contemporary paper included it is a question the surviving record does not clearly answer. What is documented is that the quote, in its most famous form, appears in sources that postdate the execution, sometimes by years, sometimes by decades. It may be true. She may have said it or something like it, and the exact phrasing refined in retelling. This is how oral history works. This is how last words acquire their polish. Or she may have said nothing that the crowd found memorable. Or she may have said something entirely different. Or she may have been crying or silent. We do not know. And that uncertainty, that gap in the record where a real person's final moments should be, is exactly where the legend found its first foothold. Here is where the story shifts. Not in the execution, not in the Charleston courtroom. The shift happens in the years after February 18th, 1820, in the space between what was recorded and what was remembered, and the distance between those two things is larger than it has any right to be. The process by which Lavinia Fisher became a serial killer is not dramatic. There was no single inventor, no one writer who sat down and decided to fabricate a legend whole. What happened was more ordinary than that, and therefore more instructive. Details accreted. Each retelling kept what was vivid and discarded what was complicated. The highway robbery became assault, became murder, because murder is more interesting than robbery, and because the human appetite for a certain kind of story, a beautiful woman, a poisoned cup, a body in the dark, does not require documentation to be satisfied. The oleander appears. In which source, and how early, is a question researchers, including Bruce Orr, who has done some of the most careful work on the gap between the Fisher legend and the Fisher record, have examined in detail. What Orr's research makes plain is that the elements of the legend, the poisoned tea, the trapdoor, the serial nature of the killings, are not present in the contemporary sources. They emerge later. Each generation's version of the story contains more murders than the last. The numbers climb. The mechanism becomes more elaborate. By the time the story reaches its modern form, Lavinia Fisher has killed dozens of travelers, possibly more, using a system of such baroque ingenuity that it strains the architecture of any actual building to contain it. No building has been found that contains it. The 6 Mile house is gone. The site is a matter of some historical debate. There is no structure standing that can be definitively identified as the Wayfarer house where John and Lavinia Fisher lived and operated and committed the crimes for which they were actually convicted. The trapdoor, accordingly, has never been excavated, measured, or otherwise physically confirmed, because there is no building beneath which to look for it. Ghost tours work around this difficulty with ease. Ghost tours do not require physical evidence. To understand why the legend grew the way it grew, it helps to sit with what the real story offered and what it didn't. A woman convicted of highway robbery, a woman who participated in, or at minimum was present for and complicit in, the robbery and potentially assault of travelers on a Carolina road. A woman who tried to escape her sentence, failed, was brought to the scaffold, and died there at 26. Her husband beside her. This is not an empty story. There is grief in it, and waste, and the particular bleakness of two people choosing a violent path and finding it end the only way such paths reliably end. There is something in Lavinia Fisher's 26 years, in whatever led her to the 6 Mile house, in whatever she calculated when she decided the road and its travelers were worth the risk. That is genuinely worth sitting with. But it is not the story that sells tickets. The story that sells tickets requires bodies, requires poison, requires a beautiful woman who is also a monster, specifically a monster who uses her beauty as the instrument of harm, who weaponizes the cup of tea, the warm room, the smile. This is not an accident of storytelling. It is a very old pattern, and it is worth naming directly. The legend of Lavinia Fisher requires her to have committed murder with her femininity. The tea she offers is warm and domestic. The smile that accompanies it is inviting, wifely, the performance of the woman who keeps the hearth. That these things are weapons, that the hospitality is the mechanism of destruction, is precisely the point. The legend is not simply about a killer. It is about a woman who killed with the tools of womanhood. And that, historically, is the kind of villain that stories find irresistible. She did not do this. There is no evidence she did this. But the story needed her to. Consider what is knowable about the actual woman. She was approximately 26 at the time of her death. The precise date of her birth does not appear in the records that have survived. She appears in the historical record primarily through the events of 1819 and 1820, through court documents, newspaper reports, and the testimony related to her arrest and trial. Before that, she is largely invisible to the archive, which is not unusual for a woman of her apparent station in early 19th century South Carolina. The records kept by the state in that era concerned themselves primarily with property, with the movement of money, and with the enslaved people who were counted as both. A young white woman of modest means on the outskirts of Charleston left fewer traces. She was married to John Fisher. She was involved in the operation of the 6 Mile house. She was present during the events that led to their arrests. Beyond that, the record thins rapidly. What the record does preserve is that she was defiant. Multiple contemporary accounts note her refusal to behave as convention demanded during the legal proceedings. The attempted exchange of clothing, if it occurred as described, suggests a woman who was willing to try almost anything, who had not accepted her fate quietly, who was looking for exits even when the walls were closing in. Whether this reads as admirable or desperate probably depends on what you bring to the story. She wore white to the scaffold. This is noted in more than one source. Her dress, white or near white, on a February morning in Charleston. The significance attached to this choice has varied by interpreter. Some see defiance in it. Some see the performance of innocence. Some see nothing more than the dress that was available to her in the jail. John Fisher, her husband, by all accounts went to his death with more conventional decorum. He confessed. He expressed the expected repentance. The crowd received him as it was prepared to receive him. Lavinia apparently did not give the crowd what it came for, and so the crowd, in a sense, took what it needed anyway, just posthumously. The smell of low country winter. January and February in Charleston are not what people imagine when they imagine the South. The air is cold enough to see your breath some mornings, damp in a way that gets into the bones, with the salt of the harbor moving through the streets and the particular gray light of a sky that hasn't decided yet whether to rain. The road 6 miles north of the city would have been muddy in that season, the ruts deep and difficult, the horses picking their footing carefully. Travelers who stopped at the 6-mile house did so for practical reasons. The road was long. The alternatives were limited. A warm fire was a warm fire. This is the context the legend strips away, the ordinariness of the place, the mundane reality of a roadside inn in 1819. Cold outside, fire inside, the smell of food and tobacco and unwashed travelers, the sounds of horses in the yard. Whatever crimes were committed in that space, they were committed in conditions that were squalid and ordinary, not theatrical. There was no trapdoor aesthetic. There was the road and poverty and choices made in conditions that the legend does not bother to examine. Why were John and Lavinia Fisher at the 6-mile house? What had the years before 1819 looked like for them? What had they been trying to build or escape, or simply survive? The archive does not say. The legend does not ask. The court proceedings that ended in conviction took place across 1819 and into early 1820. The legal record, what survives of it, reflects the standard framework of criminal prosecution in that era: charges, evidence, witnesses, verdict, sentence. The testimony of David Ross was central. Other witnesses appeared. What is notable in the record is what is absent. There is no witness to a murder. There is no physical evidence of a murder. There is no coroner's report on a body. No testimony from a family that a traveler had gone north on the Charleston Road and never arrived. No accumulated reports of missing persons that might suggest the systematic killing of travelers over an extended period. If the Fishers had been killing people, if even one person had been killed at the 6-mile house, the absence of any corresponding record is itself remarkable. People went missing in 1819. When they went missing in circumstances that attracted attention, records were made. Families wrote letters. Neighbors testified. Courts opened inquiries. For the murders of Lavinia Fisher, there are no such records, because the murders of Lavinia Fisher did not happen. What happened is that two people on the margins of Charleston society found a violent and illegal way to take money from travelers on a public road, got caught, went through the legal process that the state provided for such circumstances, and died for it. Their deaths were public. Their crime was documented. Their names were known, and then something else was written over the top of them. The first significant retellings, the ones that began to introduce elements recognizable as proto-legend, appear in the decades following the execution. The mid-19th century was, in certain ways, a fertile period for exactly this kind of story. The penny press was expanding. True crime as a popular genre was developing its appetite for sensational material. The country was hungry for domestic monsters, for villains who lived not in wild, distant places, but in the spaces of ordinary life, at the roadside inn, in the family home, behind the smiling face of hospitality. Lavinia Fisher fit the template, or could be made to fit it, with relatively minor adjustments. The adjustment of murder was the largest one. Once murder was introduced, once the story moved from robbery to killing, the other elements followed with internal logic. If she killed, she must have had a method. The method must have been elegant and hidden, because she had not been caught for murder. Hence the tea. Hence the oleander. Hence the trapdoor, which provided the elegant solution to the puzzle of concealment that every serial killer narrative requires. Where did the bodies go? Down. Into the dark. Gone. Each element solved a narrative problem. None of them required evidence, because none of them were meant as evidence. They were meant as story. and once introduced, they became nearly impossible to dislodge because they were so much more satisfying than the truth. Robbery does not require a trapdoor. By the late 19th century, the outline of the legend was established well enough that writers could embroider it with specific detail, specific numbers of victims, specific names for the poison, specific descriptions of the trapdoor's mechanism. These details appear with great confidence in sources that offer no citation for them, because there was no citation to offer. They were invention, presented with the prose confidence of fact. The 20th century added archaeology that was never performed, and architectural analysis of a structure that no longer existed. The number of victims grew. The geographic reach of the legend expanded. Lavinia Fisher's name began to appear in lists of America's most notable criminals, in early true crime anthologies, in the kind of reference material that later writers used as sources without examining the evidentiary chain behind them. Each source cited another source. Each retelling refined the previous retelling. The legend became self-reinforcing in the way that legends do, because so many people had repeated it. The repetition itself became a form of evidence, and somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the oleander and the trapdoor, and the defiant last speech, and the ghost tours, and the gift shop merchandise, and the cable television segments, there was a woman who had actually lived, and had actually died, and had committed crimes that were real, and had not committed crimes that were invented, and whose actual 26 years on this earth had been overwritten so completely that the overwriting was now what most people meant when they said her name. Charleston still runs the ghost tours. They have for decades. The 6 Mile House stop, or rather, the stop near where the 6 Mile House is said to have been, is one of the more popular features. Guides describe the oleander tea. They describe the trapdoor. They describe the beautiful hostess who lured travelers to their deaths. They speak of her with a mixture of horror and admiration that the legend demands, and the tourists photograph the darkness and feel the particular pleasurable chill of proximity to evil. What most of them do not know, because they have not been told, is that the evil they are standing near is fictional. The tours are not lying in a simple sense. They are performing a story that has been performed so many times in so many forms by so many tellers that it has achieved a kind of cultural permanence that makes distinguishing it from fact feel pedantic. What would it mean to correct the ghost tour, to stop in the middle of the street and say, "There is no evidence of poison, there is no evidence of a trapdoor"? This woman was convicted of highway robbery and hanged for it, and the rest is construction. It would mean accepting that the story you came for does not exist, that the first female serial killer was not a serial killer, that the thing that made her name worth remembering, the very thing that brought you to this corner of Charleston, that made you read the title of this video, that made you curious enough to be here right now, is a story someone told because the real story didn't seem like enough. The question the title of this video promises to answer is whether Lavinia Fisher was America's first female serial killer. The answer, stated plainly, is no. She was not a serial killer in any sense the term is used, not legally, not evidentially, not by any measure that the surviving record supports. She was convicted of highway robbery. She was executed for that conviction. If there were other crimes, and there may have been, the 6 Mile House operation appears to have been ongoing before the 1819 confrontation with the Vigilance Committee. Those crimes were also crimes of robbery and physical intimidation, not murder. The designation of first female serial killer was attached to her name in retrospect by writers working from sources that were themselves working from sources that were themselves working from imagination. The chain of attribution, followed backward, leads not to a courthouse, and not to a body, and not to a poison, but to a gap, a space in the record where a real woman's real death was insufficient for the story the culture wanted to tell. What was insufficient about it is worth thinking about. A woman who robs travelers is, in some essential sense, a woman who is operating outside the boundaries assigned to her. She is taking rather than giving. She is using force rather than persuasion. She is on the road rather than in the house. These are transgressions, but they are not the transgression that the legend requires. The legend requires her to have weaponized the domestic, to have turned the tea, the hearth, the smile into instruments of death. The legend requires her femininity to be the murder weapon. The actual crime, standing on a road with Confederates and taking money from travelers, does not require her to be a woman at all. It requires her to be a person who made a certain choice. That is a less interesting story by the logic of the legend, because it does not confirm what the legend wants to confirm, that a beautiful woman's warmth is itself a form of danger. This is not a new anxiety. It predates Lavinia Fisher by centuries, and it has outlasted her by 200 years. The legend found her name, and used it because her name was available, because she had died publicly, because she had been beautiful and defiant, and had not performed remorse correctly, and because the gap between her actual crime and the crime the legend needed was small enough to bridge with imagination. The bridge was built. Travelers cross it still. There is something to say about John Fisher, who is almost entirely absent from the legend. He was convicted of the same crime. He was hanged on the same day. He confessed before his death, which is to say he did what the occasion required of him, and received the crowd's approval for doing so. In the legend, he is present only as accessory, the husband who helped with the heavy work, the disposal, the maintenance of the trapdoor mechanism. He has no tea to pour. He has no smile to weaponize. He is not beautiful in the way the legend needs its villain to be beautiful. He died at 20-something. The record is not clear on his age. On the same scaffold, for the same crime, and his name is not on the ghost tour brochures. What that tells you about the legend is not subtle. The story was always about her. Specifically about her, about the fact of a woman who was not what she was supposed to be, not domestic in the ways domesticity was supposed to work, not deferent, not repentant, and who died unrecanted. The legend is not simply sensationalizing a robbery. It is providing an explanation for why a woman like this existed, and what she was really capable of, and why the punishment she received was ultimately correct. A woman who poisons travelers deserves to hang. The math is simple and satisfying. A woman who robs travelers on a road is a more complicated proposition. It requires asking about conditions, about the road and the cold and the poverty, and what options she had or believed she had or had exhausted before she was standing at the 6-Mile House, deciding what she was willing to do. The legend forecloses those questions. The legend provides an explanation that requires no sympathy. She was a monster. The evidence is the story. The story is the evidence. The execution itself, February 18th, 1820. The scaffold in Charleston was a public structure, and public executions drew crowds of substantial size. The day's weather is not recorded in the sources available. February in Charleston is gray more often than not, the harbor wind cutting through the city streets, the air carrying the smell of the tidal marsh that surrounds the peninsula, mud and salt, and the faint sweetness of decay that the low country carries in its bones in every season. John Fisher went first, or alongside. The accounts differ slightly on the order of proceedings. He had confessed. He addressed the crowd. He died with what the papers described as appropriate composure. Lavinia Fisher came to the scaffold in white. This much seems consistent across the sources that describe the day. What she said, or whether she said anything, is the gap in the record that the legend has most thoroughly filled. The famous line, "If any of you have a message for the devil, give it to me. I'll carry it." Consider the line itself, separate from its authenticity. It is defiant without being desperate. It is theatrical without being hollow. It positions her as willingly going somewhere the crowd fears, as someone for whom the destination of the condemned is not a terror, but an arrival. It is the line of a person who has decided at the last possible moment not to give the audience the satisfaction of repentance. If she said it, something in her refused to perform contrition for something she did not believe deserved it. Or she refused on principle, refused the ritual, the expected shape of a public death. 26 years old, white dress, cold February air, and she turns to the crowd and offers to carry their messages to the devil. If she didn't say it, if the line was composed later, polished in the retelling, attached to her name because it fit her legend, then the silence where those words should be is itself meaningful. The crowd at a public execution expected a certain kind of performance. If she denied them that performance, the silence would have been noted. A woman who died without the expected words was a woman who had to be explained, and the explanation that eventually emerged was a line that suited her legend better than any historical truth. Either way, she did not give them what they wanted. Either way, she fell. The scaffold worked the way scaffolds work. The mechanism is not described in detail in the contemporary accounts, which is itself a reflection of the era. These things were known, expected, unremarkable in their mechanics, if not in their application. The crowd watched. The papers reported. The execution of John and Lavinia Fisher was noted as having been carried out in due form. And then they were buried, or not buried in a place the record specifies, and the road 6 miles north of Charleston continued to exist, and the Wayfarer house that had been their operation fell into whatever disuse awaited structures of its kind, and the matter should, by the logic of its documentation, have been concluded. A crime, a trial, a verdict, a punishment. The record closes, except it doesn't. The record doesn't close because the legend is already forming in the space between what people saw and what they later told each other they had seen. The crowd that watched Lavinia Fisher die went home and talked about what they had witnessed, and in the talking, the edges of the story began to shift. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, and reconstructions follow the logic of story rather than the logic of event. She was beautiful. She was defiant. She did not confess. She said something, or didn't say something, that needed explaining. And the most available explanation, the one that made the story feel complete and satisfying and morally coherent, was the one that made her a monster. Not just a robber. A killer. Not just a killer. A killer who used her beauty as the weapon, who looked you in the eye across a cup of tea and watched you die. That story, once started, is very hard to stop. It became newspaper filler within years, local legend within a generation, regional mythology within half a century, a fixture of American true crime within 100 years. By the time researchers began to examine the evidentiary foundation seriously, by the time people like Bruce Orr began pulling the court records and comparing them to the legend, and finding the gap, the enormous gap, between what was documented and what was being sold. The legend was already too large to correct easily. It had been printed in books, televised, podcastified. It was in encyclopedias that other encyclopedias had cited. It was on the ghost tour. Corrections have been published. Careful historical work has been done. The gap between the legend and the record is not a secret. It is accessible to anyone willing to look for a few hours at what the contemporary sources actually say. But corrections travel more slowly than legends. They always have. The ghost tour does not include the correction. The gift shop mug does not say highway robbery. The cable television segment about America's first female serial killer does not end with a note that the murders cannot be substantiated. The Wikipedia article has caveats that the Wikipedia article's readers do not always read to the end of, and so the tour moves on. The guide's voice drops to the register appropriate for proximity to evil. The tourists photograph the dark. The legend of Lavinia Fisher, the poisoner, the trapdoor architect, the beautiful monster of the 6 Mile House, continues to be told, in the city where she actually lived, to people who came specifically to be told it. The question of what she was actually like, the 26-year-old woman underneath the legend, is one the archive cannot answer with any satisfaction. What can be inferred, with appropriate caution, from the records that do survive? She was not passive. The events of 1819 describe a woman who was present and active, not a bystander to whatever her husband was doing. Her attempted escape from the sentence, the clothing exchange, if it occurred, suggests resourcefulness and refusal. Her conduct at the scaffold suggests the same. She was not the kind of person who waited for things to happen to her. What she was before the 6 Mile House is genuinely unknown. Where she came from, what her life had looked like before it became the kind of life that ended on a scaffold in February of 1820. Whether she had family who mourned her, whether she had friends who remembered her as something other than what the courts recorded her as. The archive preserves what is useful to the archive. Women on the margins of 19th century Southern society were not useful to the archive in most of their dimensions. They appear when they cause problems. They disappear when they stop. Lavinia Fisher appeared when she caused a problem significant enough to bring the Vigilance Committee to her door. She continued to appear through the legal proceedings that followed. She appeared on the scaffold. She appears in the legend that was built on top of all of that. In every appearance, she is seen from the outside, described, assessed, convicted, executed, mythologized, always the object of someone else's account. What she thought of any of it is not recorded. What she felt on the morning of February 18th, whether she was afraid, whether she was resigned, whether the defiance that every account attributes to her was genuinely what she felt, or was the armor that fear sometimes forces people to put on. None of that was written down in any source that has survived. She fell through the record the way real people always fall through records, leaving only the traces that other people found worth preserving. The legend preserved the version that was useful. The phrase, first female serial killer, is itself worth examining briefly because the claim is so specific and so verifiable that its attachment to Lavinia Fisher's name is almost remarkable in its audacity. Serial killing has a definition. It requires multiple victims, killed separately, over time. No prosecution for murder, 0 documented murder victims. No bodies recovered, no physical evidence of murder. No contemporary record of a traveler reported killed at the 6 Mile House that has been connected to the Fishers in any evidentiary way. The legal record, which had every reason to charge murder, if murder could be charged robbery. The first part of the claim compounds the problem because it implies that researchers have determined not only that she was a serial killer, but that she was the first American woman to achieve that status. The claim requires both that she committed serial murders and that no American woman before her had done so. Neither part of that claim is supportable. The phrase exists because it is useful. It is a search term. It is a hook. It does in 6 words what it would take paragraphs of nuance to undo, and the paragraphs of nuance do not fit on a ghost tour brochure. The phrase is, in miniature, what the whole legend is, in large. A story told in the service of something other than accuracy. The weight of what was done to Lavinia Fisher is not, finally, about justice. She committed crimes. She was tried for them. The sentence she received was severe, grotesquely severe, by the standards of any era that has since reconsidered capital punishment for robbery. But it was the sentence the law prescribed, applied by a court that had before it genuine evidence of genuine crimes. The weight is something else. It is the way the real person was used. The way her death, which was already a form of consumption, a public spectacle arranged for the benefit of the crowd, became the raw material for a story that consumed her entirely. She was not given the chance to be complicated. She was not given the chance to be 26 years old in 1820. making bad choices in hard circumstances, dying for them on a February morning, and then being done with it. She was given instead a legend. The legend made her famous. The legend made her name last 200 years. The legend put her face on merchandise, and her story on television, and her ghost on ghost tours that people pay money to take. The legend also erased her completely. What walks through Charleston on those tours is not Lavinia Fisher. It is a composite, the poisoner, the beauty, the trapdoor architect, assembled from what people needed a female villain to be, not from what any actual woman in 1820 South Carolina was or did or suffered. The name is hers. The person is not. Bruce Orr's research and the work of other historians who have looked carefully at the Fisher case makes clear that the evidentiary foundation of the legend is absent. This is not a contested scholarly question, in the sense that there are not historians defending the authenticity of the trapdoor against historians skeptical of it. The skeptical position is the documented position. The documents do not support the legend. What the documents support is a trial for highway robbery, a conviction, and a hanging. It is worth knowing this. It is worth sitting with the discomfort of knowing it. The discomfort of having arrived at this video because the title promised you a serial killer, and being offered instead a woman who robbed travelers and was hanged for it, and was then overwritten by a story so much larger than she ever was. The discomfort is the point, not because you were tricked. The title is accurate, in the sense that it describes what Lavinia Fisher has been called, and then immediately promises to examine whether the call was true, but because the discomfort is what the legend was designed to prevent. The legend is not designed to make you uncomfortable. It is designed to make you satisfied. A serial killer explains herself. A serial killer justifies the scaffold. A serial killer lets the story close neatly around her, with the punishment matching the crime in a way that feels morally complete. A robber who was hanged in 1820 for taking money from travelers on a road does not close neatly. It opens onto questions about the law, and about poverty, and about who gets hanged and who does not, and about what Charleston in 1820 was doing to the people who lived on its margins. Those questions do not have satisfying answers. They have complicated, unresolved, ongoing answers. The legend prevents those questions from being asked. That is what legends are for. Lavinia Fisher has been dead for more than 200 years. The city where she lived and died is still there. The road that was called the Charleston-Columbia Road is still there, under different asphalt, carrying different traffic. The Wayfarer houses are gone. The Vigilance Committee is gone. The scaffold is gone. The legend is not gone. It is on the tour. It is in the books. It is in the articles that compile lists of history's most notorious female criminals, where her name appears alongside women who actually killed people, placed among them as though the category were the same. She is on podcast episode lists and cable television criminal profiles and social media accounts dedicated to true crime history, and in none of those places, or in vanishingly few of them, does anyone mention the highway robbery conviction, or David Ross, or the absence of bodies, or the fact that the most famous line attributed to her appears in no contemporary source. She has become exactly what the culture needed her to be. A monster with a beautiful face, a cautionary tale about the danger of a woman's warmth, a story that feels old enough to be true, and dramatic enough to repeat. The truth is neither old enough nor dramatic enough, apparently. A young woman, a road, a crime, a rope. The rest was added by people who found that insufficient, and in finding it insufficient, they told you something about themselves that they probably did not intend to tell. The last thing to say about Lavinia Fisher is the hardest thing to say, because it requires holding two truths at once that the legend was specifically designed to prevent you from holding together. She was not innocent. She participated in real crimes against real people. Crimes of violence and theft. Crimes that left their victims afraid and diminished. Crimes that the court of 1819 South Carolina had both the evidence and the jurisdiction to prosecute. Nothing in this reconstruction absolves her of what she actually did, and the story that replaced her, the legend that used her name and her death and her defiance to build a monster, was also a crime. Not a legal one, a different kind, the kind that has no court, no verdict, no sentence, the kind where a real person is taken apart and reassembled in a shape that is useful to someone else, and the original is discarded. And the discarding is so complete that 200 years later you have to look quite carefully to find what was actually there. The ghost tours run on Friday nights in Charleston. They run on Saturday nights too, and some Thursdays, and on request. The guides wear period costumes, or something that passes for it. The tourists take photographs in the dark and feel the pleasant chill of proximity to a story they believe is true. At the end of the tour, back near the hotel district, someone buys a coffee. Someone checks their phone. Someone says to someone else, "Can you imagine? She killed all those people. She poisoned them. She was beautiful and she poisoned them." And there was a trap door. Lavinia Fisher, 26 years old, highway robber, hanged on a February morning in a city that is still running tours about her, does not correct them. She can't. That's the part of the legend they got right.